Hi everybody, this is Peggy McGuire and we're in English 106, Written Business Communication. And today our topic is going to be focusing on business writing as a problem-solving process. And I'll talk a little more about what I mean shortly, but we're going to be focusing on that kind of writing, which then brings us to who we're writing to and what they need. So we're looking at what we want to accomplish by writing in a business context. And then once we think about what we want to accomplish, how we adapt that message depending on who we are writing to and how to build goodwill with our audience in the process. So let's get going. So, writing as a problem-solving process. When I use the term problem here, I'm using it very broadly. You are faced with something you need to do, something you need to accomplish, a problem you need to solve, an issue you need to deal with. So problem very broadly is an issue, a question that needs to be answered, something that needs to get done. That's what I mean by problem in this broad sense. So I've got something I need to do and I need to do it with writing. So now I'm going to figure out how to do that. So here's my issue, here's my problem, here's my question. The first thing I want to do is look at what information I have that I can use in writing to solve this problem, to deal with this issue, to accomplish what I need to accomplish. I look at what I already know. Then I decide what more I need to know, what more information I'll need. Then I figure out how to get that information. I get that information, then I bring it together with the information I already had. I think about everything I now know, and based on what I now know, in terms of how to solve this problem, I start brainstorming possible solutions to the problem, possible answers to the question, possible ways to deal with the issue. I look at each of those possible solutions, and then I decide which one is most likely to work, or which ones are most likely to work. So basically, what I just described is a good problem-solving process. That's basically how you effectively solve problems in the world. Have the information you need, figure out what to do with that information, come up with possible solutions, and then choose the one that you think will best work. That's good problem solving, and that's what we do when we are writing to solve problems. All right, so once I've done that kind of planning about what I know and what information I'm going to need to convey in order to solve this problem, then basically what I've done is think about my writing purpose. And always in this course and with writing, good writing in general, I think always about purpose related to audience. So my planning, once I've gathered my information and thought about it and come up with a possible solution to my problem, my next question is, who am I writing to? Who is my audience? What does my audience already know about this issue, this problem, this question? And what do they need to know? What do they expect to find out? What do they want to learn by reading what you write, by reading your message? Okay? So, right away, what we see here is a balancing act that happens all the time in effective written communication. I am balancing what I need to accomplish, my purpose, and what my audience wants and needs and expects from my written message. So I'm constantly balancing what I need to accomplish and what my audience wants and needs. Right? So those two questions are always in my mind and are always directing my communication. So some specific questions that get at that purpose and audience balance. What information or facts that I had gathered do I now need to include in my message? And what do I want to emphasize? What do I want to de-emphasize? What can I drop? What do I not need? So how am I going to use this information that I've gathered to solve the problem? Next, and related to that, when I'm thinking about what information I want to use, I'm thinking in terms of what reasons or benefits will best convince my audience to agree with me, or to do what I want them to do, or help me solve the problem, or understand the solution that I've come up with. So I'm thinking about my information, what I want to accomplish, but also which of the reasons that I could come up with will best convince my audience. What benefits to my audience can I convey so that they will most likely do what I want them to do, or understand what I want them to understand. And then there's purpose and there's audience, but also there's sort of overall context, the situation in which I am trying to solve this problem or answer this question. Are there any other aspects of the situation or of the context that might be important to remember as I convey my information? Okay, so I've thought about my purpose, I've thought about my audience, and I've thought about the context in which I'm trying to solve this problem. So now I'm ready to think about what sort of organizational pattern of writing will best suit my purpose, audience, and situation. All right? I want a document that's going to contain my message so that it's easy to read, it's visually inviting, and it gets my message across in a good, concise way that my audience will understand. And there are lots of different features of text that we'll talk about over the next classes that help audiences get engaged in the writing that I'm doing. So things like, do I want to use headings in my message? Do I want to make lists? Do I want to use number points or bullet points? Am I using short paragraphs? Am I using white space well? There are lots of things that make writing more visually interesting. And the more visually interesting it is, the more likely people are going to stick with it, read it, and try to understand it. So again, we'll talk a lot more about design in these ways over the next classes. So on the front end, I think about design, and I think about what kind of document will best serve my purpose here and best reach my audience. So that's in the planning stage and the drafting stage, but now we move to the revising stage. And that means that once I have written something, I make sure to go back to it and check it to make sure it's doing the job that I want it to do. So part of that is the information there accurate? Is it stated in a positive and business-like yet friendly way? This is what we call taking a you attitude. In other words, an attitude that respects and reaches out to the audience, all right, in a way that is friendly yet formal and businesslike. Okay. Another way to think about revision, if we're thinking about content, we're also thinking about correctness. Is my spelling, grammar, and punctuation okay? Always proofread business messages. You do not want to send anything out that's not clean. It's distracting, and it might be offensive to your reader to see something that clearly you haven't been careful enough with. So you need to take care to make sure that the writing is correct, as well as addressing the content that you wanted to address. Okay, so you've checked for content, you've checked for correctness, you send the message out. Now, your next way of knowing whether or not you've met your purpose is to get feedback. What kind of feedback or response do you get from your message? And is it the feedback you wanted or needed? If yes, that means you've done a pretty good job, and you might want to look at why you did a good job of conveying your message. But if no, if you're getting strange feedback, or you're getting a lot of questions or a lot of indications that people don't understand or are struggling to understand your message, then you better go back and figure out why. You better go back and read what you wrote and say, why is this confusing people? Or why are they reacting in such a negative way? What did I do to contribute to that response? I want to, in order for the next time for that not to happen. So if I get the feedback I want, why? If I don't get the feedback I want, why not? All right. So there's the piece about thinking about what you need to accomplish, what your audience needs, what the situation is, and then you create your message based on the answers to those questions. Now let's look a little more deeply at this piece of audience. It is so critical to be thinking about your audience and knowing as much as you can about who is reading what you write and who you're trying to reach. So first of all, in the big picture, the kinds of audiences who might end up reading what you write. Hopefully, the primary audience is going to be the folks who you need to read this in order to make some sort of decision or to act in some way that you want them to act. So those are the people you're focusing on most specifically, and therefore we call them your primary audience. The people who you want to do something or to act in some way or to make some kind of a decision. But in a business context, it's quite likely that other people will be reading what you write beyond your primary audience. So people who that primary audience might then go talk to about what you wrote. They might ask for comments, or they might ask people to do what you asked them to do. These are the people we call your secondary audience. So they're getting the message secondhand, but they're still being asked to think or do or act in some way. Okay? Then there's the people who actually control whether or not the primary audience will ever see your message. These are the people we call gatekeepers. So for instance, if you're writing a message to coworkers, but your supervisor wants to look it over before you send it out, your supervisor is acting as a gatekeeper in that way. Look it over to make sure it's appropriate, to make sure it's correct, to make sure that everything's good, all the information is there, for whatever reasons. There may be somebody who gets to decide whether or not your message is ready to go. That's a gatekeeper. Now, drawing out a little further from gatekeepers are the people who actually have the power to base any future actions on what they think about your ideas, on how they've responded. So let's say you've written some recommendations to your supervisor. Well, your supervisor is going to be responding, but also it may be that in order to evaluate or act on your recommendations, that supervisor has to go to the board. So the board would be the watchdogs here. They would be the people who give the supervisor the okay or not to follow up on your recommendations. So they'd be the watchdogs. And then finally, there's the kind of people who may end up seeing what you wrote, but don't really have any stake in acting upon what you wrote or making any decisions about it. And those we would call your auxiliary audience. So that's sort of in the big picture, the kinds of audiences that are out there who may be seeing and thinking about what you write. So I think about who I'm trying to reach, and then I try to go a little deeper in thinking about who's likely to read this message and who I want to read this message. So how do I analyze those folks? What do I know about them? How can I find out more about them? Because I want to pay attention and use my own common sense to decide what's the best way to reach them. So all of this analysis of your audience is about making decisions about how to write in a way that's most likely to get people to do what you want them to do. So pay attention to who they are, who these people are that you're trying to reach, and how you can find out more about them. Use empathy. Try to put yourself in their shoes to feel what they might be feeling. So to the extent that that's possible, get to know people and how they might be feeling about what you write. Now, businesses have done a lot of work and invested a lot of energy and financial resources into doing the kind of audience analysis that I'm talking about here, because they have a stake in knowing their audience as well. And so there are several strategies that have been used that are designed to give a business that kind of very specific information about who is likely to read and respond to their messages. So I'm curious if anybody listening to this has ever taken the Myers-Briggs test. The Myers-Briggs test is a personality test. In other words, it's designed to get for an individual to be able to match your best communication strategy with what you know about your own personality. So I want to know more about your personality so I can decide how to reach you best in writing. So it's a very extensive and very intense analysis of individual personality traits. And it can give people a lot of very specific information that they can then try to use to manipulate messages so that they best reach that personality. Then, if what you're doing is analyzing groups of people who may end up being your audience, you can use available demographic information. You can go to local resources to find out about age, sex, race, income levels of groups of people, whether that's your community, your city, your state, your region. There are places you can go to get that kind of information. There are also companies who specialize in doing what we call psychographic research, which doesn't look at your age or your sex or your race. It looks at what you value, what you believe, what your goals are. And they do testing to find out that information, to generate data that generalizes about what a group of people have in common, and therefore giving me a tool to try to decide what information might be important to them based on what they value, what they believe. So there's a lot of research done just to get at this idea with individuals and groups about what they are most likely to value and believe and care about. So we can use that information if we need to. If we're actually within an organization and we are trying to figure out how to most effectively impact the people within an organization, one of the best ways to do that is to watch, to observe how people relate to each other, what kind of discourse they carry on among each other. Because that will tell you a lot about what people listen to, what they pay attention to, what they care about, by watching people talking to each other and responding to each other in various ways. So that's our own personal research we can do within an organization to analyze an audience. So now we've really thought about all of the issues that get us to a point where we can now decide what kind of writing is going to best reach the audience and best meet my purpose. We call these kinds of writing channels. All right. So based on what I now know about my audience, what's the best vehicle? What's the best channel to reach them? We're talking about writing here. So what we're talking about are things like An email, a letter, a brochure or a flyer, a text message, a sticky note, an article in a local newspaper or magazine. You see, we're talking about a lot of different kinds of writing depending on who you're trying to reach and what your goal is. All right, so I know my audience, I know my purpose, I know the situation in which I'm writing. I've decided on a channel, a kind of writing to do, and now I go back and think again about audience. I adapt to what I believe they will respond to. So, what do I think is going to be their reaction? How can I help them see the importance of the message I'm sending? How much information do they need? And what obstacles will I have to overcome? Are they going to be resistant in some way? Are they going to have questions? Are they going to need, I don't know, a lot of hand-holding to get to where you want them to get? What positive things can I experience and put out to them? What can I emphasize that's going to make them feel good about doing what I want them to do? What kind of writing, what style of writing would my audience expect? In a business setting, in most cases, it would certainly at least be a formal, yet businesslike, yet friendly kind of writing and organization. And how will my audience read and use the document I send them? Will they immediately and carefully read everything I write? Will they put it off until later when they have less pressing things to deal with? Will they actually read the whole thing? People can be very busy and can maybe skim or maybe just read the headers or the first couple of sentences to try to figure out what you're saying without actually having to read the entire document. So think about what's most likely to happen when that document is in the reader's hands. Okay, a little more about making the audience feel good about your message. And you're going to hear this word a lot, benefits. What benefits can you stress with your audience? What can you say that's going to make the audience feel good about what you say? And generally speaking, we talk about two kinds of benefits that people can experience as a result of doing something. They are either intrinsic or extrinsic. Intrinsic benefits are those that are considered to be internal as opposed to external. That they are things that you feel, things that you experience, but that you can't necessarily like hold in your hands or observe directly. And yet they are very important, in fact, very strong motivators for people to do something or feel good about something. Things like feeling a sense of pride as a result of doing what I'm asked to do. Feeling pleasure, feeling satisfaction as a result of reading that message and saying, yes, I can do that, or oh, this makes sense. That it just feels good inside. And it's a sort of automatic response. You don't have to work on it. It just comes. Pride, pleasure, satisfaction. All right, so those are intrinsic benefits. There are also a whole set of extrinsic benefits, in other words, external. Things that you add on. This is not something that's automatic. This is something that you get in addition to yourself. So, things like money, awards, praise, coming from outside and rewarding you in some way. Those are extrinsic benefits. The other benefit, the kind of benefit you might want to stress, is that you sort of promise that if you do what I ask you to do, you will get the benefit that I'm saying you'll get. So you want to be realistic and logical, but you also have to be trustworthy, So if I, in my writing, promise you something, I better make sure I can make that something happen and explain how I'm going to do it. All right? Especially with the intrinsic. How can I be sure that you're going to feel good? You're going to feel satisfied. You're going to get a sense of pleasure out of doing what I asked you to do. I better explain how I can make that happen. So, we're talking about audience benefits that are there already, that people do experience one way or another. But there are also things that I can do as the writer, creating a picture to really sort of create audience benefits. Once again, by paying attention to who my audience is and what they care about, and using my own common sense and using empathy, putting myself in their shoes. And by that combination of approaches, I come up with what kind of feelings or needs or fears might motivate the people I'm trying to reach. And then, what about my idea or the product I'm trying to sell might address those feelings or needs or fears? And my job as the writer, as the communicator, is to demonstrate the connection between the two. The connection between what my audience feels, needs, fears, and what I'm giving them, what I'm offering, my product, my idea, my recommendation. What's the connection? I have to make that connection as the reader. Excuse me, as the writer, because I can't expect the reader to do it for me. I'm the one who is responsible for demonstrating the connection between what they want or need and what I can deliver. And that's my challenge in the writing. So a lot of what I'm saying here is about trying to reach people at the point where they want something and they can most likely get it if they do what I ask them to do. But there's also a more general way in which I, as the writer, will benefit by building goodwill all the time with my audience, by taking every strategy I can and every opportunity I have to build goodwill. And here again is that term I used a little earlier, by taking a you attitude in my writing. So I am showing that I am paying attention to my readers and I am empathizing with them to the extent that I can. So how do I build this goodwill over time whenever I communicate with my readers? First, I talk about them and not me. If I'm trying to get an audience to do something, to act in some way, agree with me, to take my recommendation, I don't want to focus on me. I want to focus on them. That's what you attitude is. Talk about them. Talk about their aspirations, their hopes, their needs. Right? That's how you grab the attention of your audience. To the extent you can, you do that by looking at and talking about specific requests or questions or orders that have come from your audience. And especially when you're selling something, your customers. All right. Avoid at all costs discussing feelings unless congratulations or condolences are appropriate. Otherwise, we don't need to talk about feelings. All right. We're talking about practicality. We're talking about needs, goals, expectations. All right. But certainly there is that caveat that if part of the job here is for you to congratulate people, by all means do it, or send condolences. All right. Now, we've talked about good news and bad news messages. So let's talk about addressing your audience in those contexts. If you've got positive news, good news to send, then it's okay to directly address your audience as you. All right, you can talk to you because that increases the focus on the audience. And with good news, that's a good thing to do. All right. So within your writing, you can directly address your audience by using you. However, if the news is bad, if it's a negative message, a message that you think folks aren't going to want to hear or are going to be unhappy about, then what you want to do is avoid directly addressing your audience as you. Because the last thing you want to do is to give a sense that you're blaming or you're singling out the people who are reading your message. So don't talk about you, talk about us. um, or talk about people or customers or what, use more general terms when the news is bad, and don't finger point in text by using you. All right. So that's sort of like specific approaches. Now let's talk about the content and organization of your message. How you build goodwill, and this is absolutely critical. The best way to build goodwill in writing for business is to make sure that when you send your message, you have included all the important information that your reader needs. You have not held anything back. You've not avoided information that's important. You want your audience to believe that you are being a fair broker of the information. So you are as transparent as possible. You give the audience all the information needed to do what you want them to do. Okay? And then you think about that information and you think about, what will my audience most care about? Well, I put that first. So the writer always starts with the information that the audience most cares about. I clearly describe how that information is going to affect them. Again, I need to come across as an honest and reliable source. So I give all the information they need and I describe how it will affect them. I also, if I'm smart, try to think ahead and anticipate any questions that the audience is going to have now and answer them right in my message. So you may be wondering right now, blah, 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 and answer the question now rather than waiting for the audience to ask it. So if I can come up with what are the most likely questions people are going to ask and answer them right up front, I'm going to save myself a lot of time and resources later. And then make the information as easy to access as possible within the text that you write. And often that means doing things like using headings if it's a longer message, putting things into bullet or numbered lists instead of writing long sentences. So, and other strategies that we use to make the information as easy to get at as possible within the message. Another big piece of building goodwill is always emphasizing the positive if you possibly can. And you do that through the words you choose to use, by focusing on what your audience can do about a situation that may not be the most joyful. By, if you have to bring up negatives, by linking the negative to something positive. Like if you can come up with some benefit that that the audience will experience, even though there will be some negative stuff going on. And by keeping negative stuff away from the beginning or the end of your message. When you have negative, bad news kinds of information, you want to put it in the middle. So that at the beginning, you can start off with some kind of positive, affirming statement. And at the end, you can close with some kind of positive, forward-looking statement. So the bad news then gets cushioned in the middle, and it's brief. Okay, you don't have to go on and on about bad news. Get it clearly, get it honestly, get it concisely in there, but don't dwell on it. And always be appropriate, be sincere, and be realistic in your message. That's how you're going to get where you need to go. your tone. This is tricky because now we're not talking about speaking, we're talking about writing. So, tone is about what your attitude sounds like in the words that you use. And that's a hard one to get at. But it starts with the kind of attitude you are conveying in the message that you're sending. All right? And what you want, where your goal is to always be businesslike without sounding stiff or overly formal in your language. So, friendly, businesslike, straightforward. Friendly but not phony. Don't gush to people who are not used to you gushing. All right? So friendly but not phony. Confident without being arrogant. You have to sound like you're in charge. You have to sound like you know what you're doing. You have thought a lot about what you're writing. You feel like what you're saying is the best possible message. You need to come across with that kind of confidence, but that doesn't mean you need to sound like you're better than anyone or that you know more than anyone. So you don't want to be arrogant, but it is possible to be confident without being arrogant. And then on the other side of that, it's also possible to be polite without being groveling. All right, that goes back to that sort of businesslike, friendly, polite, engaging, but not um, begging your reader to pay attention to you. You know, you should not have to do that. If your message is sound, if you've got all the information that you need and you're conveying it honestly, then you don't need to indulge in trying to get the audience to love you. That's not what this is about. This is about confident, professional work in your writing. And then finally, we come to the whole issue of bias and being extremely careful to monitor everything I write for bias. Because what we're talking about here is building goodwill. The last thing you want to do to build goodwill is to offend people, even if you don't realize you're offending them. So you want to monitor, um, you know, your writing in several ways. And the first one is you want to make sure that it is non-sexist. So whether you're writing to men or women, you're using the same neutral language in job titles. And this is extremely important. So if you're using a job title, make sure that it is a sexually neutral job title, no matter who you're writing to. Do not assume anything about whether people are married or not when you're using courtesy titles and names. Never use Mrs., for instance, to refer to a woman. Do not ever use anything that assumes a marital status in titles and names. Generic pronouns that are sexist. That's the whole he, she thing where for years we said, well, when we're referring to one person, we'll use he, but everybody knows that it means he or she. No, everybody does not know. And we do not use he to refer to both men and women. All right, so that is a long gone sort of misconception about how to professionally address the reader of your writing. You do not use generic pronouns that actually are not generic at all, that refer to one sex or the other. And just basically stay away from any words or phrases that sound like they're assuming somebody's married or assuming someone's heterosexual. Just stay away. Stay with language that treats people neutrally when it comes to sex. That's what, that's what you want to monitor for. Is this staying neutral? Am I making some assumptions without realizing it about the sex or sexual orientation of the people I'm writing to? Just avoid the words that get you in that kind of trouble. There are plenty of ways to address people that are not sexist. So find them and use them. Is my language non-racist and non-ageist? No stereotypes ever of any group. And in fact, you really don't need to be talking about age or race unless age or race are directly relevant to the purpose that you're writing for. If they are specifically lined up with your message, that you must talk about age or race. All right? Otherwise, there's no reason to do it. Just stay away from it. All right? If you do need to refer to a group, a racial or age group, then make sure that you use the terminology that is preferred by that group. And guess what? You can ask. There is nothing wrong with asking what is the preferred term for your group. Okay? And be prepared, because you might ask let's say you might ask two people with dark skin what the preferred word is, and one might say African American, another might say black. And that's fine, because it's not our job to decide what's the best term. It is our job to educate ourselves about preferences. So it's okay to ask. And stay away from any terminology that that suggests that somebody who's competent or attractive is not usually in that group. So, yeah, I think I think you can figure out what I'm talking about. But talking about, well, let's say young people. Let's say a 16-year-old, and somehow you write about how surprising it is that person is so mature. Well, that's insulting, and don't do it. Same thing with an old person. Boy, for 86, she sure is light on her feet. No, you don't make any kinds of statements that would suggest that someone within a group is not usually there, or that kind of person would not usually be in that group. Just don't do it. It just doesn't work, and you don't need to do it. People with disabilities. This is one really nifty trick is what we call people first language. We refer to the person before we refer to the disability. So notice the header here, people with disabilities, as opposed to disabled people. All right? It's just a nifty way to focus on the people as opposed to the disability. And once again, if there is a question about what term would be most appropriate for a group, ask the group for preference of the language. Cannot hurt. Educate ourselves. So much of this is about, as we said earlier, paying attention, learning about what's best, getting to know my audience. And that means sometimes actually doing some research so that I know my audience.